Hi, BookTube, and welcome to a new video. This is going to be a discussion video on a subject that's sort of come into the sort of BookTube debate from sort of several different angles, and I just wanted to offer my thoughts on it. So the first source on this is Roz over at Scully Dangling About the Books, who released a video yesterday, which I shall post a link to, about a story which I wasn't actually familiar with, whereby a judge in a UK court had doled out the punishment to a boy who was caught with lots of illegal literature of sort of racist, homophobic nature, basically sort of stuff that the far right would produce. And instead of sending him into a custodial sentence, he said that the boy should be made to read classic literature, Austen, Dickens, this kind of thing. And presumably the judge thought that if the boy did that, that it would turn him away from the sort of hatred that this literature suggested that he felt. And Roz sort of expanded that out into, can literature change the way we think and feel? Does it make us better people? And the second source for this was Jim over at Jim's Reading Books and Stuff, in one of his letter tags, which is the letter N, had this prompt. In Northanger Abbey, Catherine Morland's reading affected how she saw the world. Has your reading affected the way that you see the world? Now, I did that letter N tag and I answered that, and but I kind of guess I want to expand on my answer significantly by, bringing these two questions, which are very, very similar, very, very linked, together in my response. Now, the first thing I want to say is I'm going to answer this as a writer much more than a reader. The second thing to say is, what is fiction for? The primary thing of fiction, like anything, is it's entertainment. It has to entertain us. Otherwise, why would we do it? We're not masochists. Although those of us who find it difficult to bail, sometimes it can seem that way when we plough onto the bitter end of a bad book. But anyway, now the problem with entertainment, and particularly the problem that literature faces, is that it's a really crowded marketplace. There's so many competing claims on us for entertainment. So that can be watching golf or playing golf, watching Love Island, doing macrame, any of these things, and any art form has to go up against all these things and many, many more. And it's not a fair fight really, because literature, particularly quite serious, demanding literature, is going to winnow out a lot of people who'd rather watch Love Island or rather do macrame or whatever. So literature has to be entertaining. That is its first and foremost purpose. So I want to park that aside. I almost treat that as a given. What else can literature give us? And when I say literature, I'm talking specifically about fiction here. So Roz's video sort of discussed whether the judge's motives were that he honestly felt that in reading these books it would make the boy more empathic to other people outside of his own social milieu, which would be a change for the better, obviously, to sort of see that his right-wing screeds were just out of order, beyond the pale, and not the way to think. A noble thought from the judge, but I think Roz was equally sceptical to me. Is I don't think people change their thinking through literature and literature alone. I think it's more chance of it happening for formative minds when you experience literature for the first time, and you may have your eyes opened as to what the world of literature can offer, and that can sort of open you up to all sorts of following different trails and stuff. And this boy is perhaps young enough to still fall into that. But for the likes of sort of grizzled old sort of reading hacks like me, I don't think literature can significantly change our worldview. Now, one book, for example, that people might proffer to say, well, no, that's not the case. Literature can have an effect on the real world, indeed some of Dickens' sort of political proselytising may be affected, because he was so widely read, may be affected the public view on certain things. But, you know, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin was so widely read. It was felt to help a sort of a shift in mentality amongst the northern states of America against slavery. Impossible to quantify, really. And you know, there are sort of arguments that book is more propaganda than literature, but I haven't even read it, so I'm not getting involved in that debate. But I think it would be really hard now to have a book that had a similar sort of effect as that one supposedly did. Not, again, returning to my argument about how reading as entertainment has to compete with so many other things. Not enough people are reading books to make a sort of quantitative difference in sort of, even if the people who read certain books, even if it did change their minds, they're not a significant enough majority within a population to make any difference. And as I say, the more serious and high level and highbrow and hard hitting a novel, the fewer readers it's going to have compared to people who go and pick up, you know, crime thrillers in airport, you know, shops to read on their flight or whatever. So I don't really think books can have an external effect on the world. Again, in the 60s, you had a TV drama such as Cathy Come Home, which raised the plight of homelessness, I think. Or was it abortion? I can't remember. But anyway, but the 60s is such a different time from now, where again you've got this sort of huge diversity of inputs, of entertainment sources, even the way we consume them, with all the different platforms and Netflix and Amazon Prime, and you know, it's no longer just terrestrial TV like it was in the 1960s, when there are only 2 or 3 channels. So the mechanism by which any art form can affect a significant number is diluted, inevitably. But you know, a lot of this is kind of technical stuff that doesn't really interest me. I want to talk about it as a writer. And to me, readers read fiction for lots of different readers. Some like plot, some like characters, some like the setting, particularly if it's history or a historical setting or a culture they're not familiar with. Some like just the writing style. You know, there's all sorts of reasons why different readers like books. And that's great, and that's fine. And I think if you drew up a list of 10, most people would sort of plot 4, 5, 6 with the reasons why they like the type of books that they do. Some are like escapism. Some like believe that they're engaging with the real world through a book, which I will come back to. So there's not one reason why we read beyond the reason of entertainment. So I just want to put that out there. But the thing about fiction to me is it can only tell you about fiction. That every book that is written is in a dialogue, whether consciously or not, with every fiction book that's come before. Because a novel does not occur in nature. The form of a novel does not occur in nature. The narrative structure of a novel does not occur in nature. It is a man-made, woman-made thing. And there are rules about it, but rules which could be broken. There, since the earliest novels, the form of the novel has changed inevitably. So, for me, primarily, a novel can only tell us about the novel. But you go, well, hang on a minute. There's all sorts of stuff beyond that you can get from a novel that does pertain to the real world. So the first thing is, and going back to The Judge, is when we read about other people, and particularly other people in other cultures and other times, it encourages us to have an empathy, for us to be able to relate to what's being described in a book from people who are outside of our own personal milieu and demographics. We develop an empathy. And that's, probably true, but if you think about it, it's an empathy for someone who's not a real human being. It's an empathy for a character constructed from a writer's imagination. So it's not strictly true 100% correlation empathy with another human being. It's an empathy for a constructed human being, and one that in some ways relays more about the author who constructed it than the character that they've constructed. So that's the first thing to say. But even if you were reading a book about someone from a country that you had no knowledge of, so let's say I read a book from Lesotho. I don't think I've ever read a book from Lesotho, but let's say I did. So the author was from Lesotho themselves, and the book's set there. And you could say, oh, well, I'm learning stuff about Lesotho that, I never knew. And on one level, that's obviously true. But what you're getting from that book is a representation of Lesotho that is one out of a myriad. That is the author's personal take on the country that they're writing about, which is perfectly legitimate. But that doesn't mean you're getting the whole skinny of the country of Lesotho or the whole history of Lesotho. You're getting one version of it. So again, I think it's limited. I think the knowledge that you get from a book, from another time and another culture, another country, is limited. And that's why I come back to saying, ultimately, all you get from a novel is about novels. But this is where I diverge as an author from most of my fellow authors. Because we are writing fiction, we are avowedly writing fiction, but fiction can translate back into real life. Not on a one-to-one correlation, because the clue's in the word fiction, it's not real. But the way I think it can sort of feed back into the real world is that I honestly believe, and this informs my writing, I honestly believe that the world we live in and what we take as reality is based on many, many assumptions and presumptions that don't necessarily have any basis in fact, that they are consensual constructions because they work, they help us. To some extent they have evolved over mankind's evolution in terms of what our senses and what our sense perception presents us and how we interpret that information. A lot of that, it's not hardwired, but it's readily transmissible across the generations. But again, these are built on certain assumptions. So for example, our eyes, the visual information our senses take in, we are only really working on about 15% of what we see, because when we scan the environment in front of us, we're filtering out the stuff we expect to see there. We're only scanning for unpredictable things that may threaten us and provoke our flight or fight reflexes. And that's an evolutionary thing. But that, we have these sort of template maps in our head as to what we should be viewing when we walk in the street or when we walk on a beach or, whatever, when we're up in a helicopter. The assumption is what we see is what should be there, because we're not interested in that. We're only interested in disorders from that could potentially be, have consequences. But those assumptions and those templates in the back of our heads, which, as I say, have come through evolution, they define reality. But that doesn't make them reality. That is, we are comfortable that makes reality, constructs reality, because we make that work for us. Because that reality in all its non-threateningness, that the sky is blue and the sea is blue-green and the grass is green and all this sort of stuff, that works, that familiarity works for us, so that we can ignore it like we ignore the feeling of a watch on your wrist after time. You don't keep feeling that, because it would drive your brain crazy with sort of firing all these sort of sensory inputs if you kept feeling it, or the shirt on your back or whatever. We are only looking for the stuff that's out of sequence and out of order and things like that. And as I say, that works for us on a day-to-day basis, in the same way that we don't need to know how the quantum world works on a day-to-day basis. We don't need to know how gravity works on a day-to-day basis, because that's not the scale that we operate on a day-to-day basis. Gravity only really comes into effect, when you're leaving the Earth's atmosphere, Or, you know, a child is learning about gravity when it sort of builds a tower and knocks it over, and the fact that the tower of bricks fall down, not fall up, and all this sort of stuff. But on a day-to-day basis, we don't, you know, acknowledge these things because we take them for granted. So all of these presumptions, all of this stuff, in the physical material world, it works for us. You know, it doesn't inhibit us from daily living. But the problem is when you get to things like politics and institutions and interpersonal relationships and all that stuff, because that's not based in a material world. These are human functions and laws that are laid down. And that is where the presumptions and the assumptions become much more problematical, because they tend to reflect power relationships between mankind. And if you've got a power relationship, that means you've got someone with more power than someone else. And this is where I think fiction comes in useful, because I honestly believe as a writer that I can pursue fiction to help me and my readers spot other fictions that we take as fact in life. So it's more like a skill rather than a hard and fast translation of what this book is saying about the reality of, you know, a building it describes is based on a real building, which if you then went to see the real building, you know, you could translate across from one to the other. That's not what I'm saying fiction can offer. I'm saying that it allows us, it gives us the tools potentially to dig beneath the surface relationships, to see actually no, that's built on, you know, sand. There's no reason for it other than it works for the people that it benefits and things like that. So this notion of fiction, I think, is a tool that you can take into real life. In the same way as recently, all sorts of people have tried to provide us tools of how to spot fake news, deliberately generated fake news, be it from Russia or China or whoever, seem to have caught us hopping on the hop, and now we're getting these tools on how to recognise it, you know, how to spot, you know, sort of bots on Twitter or Russian troll farms, all this sort of stuff. It's a tool that we're being provided with to then go and translate stuff as we encounter it. And I think fiction provides an equivalent tool, not for fake news, but for fake assumptions of reality. For us to go back into our real worlds, whatever that means, and discern that actually just because this is stated to be so, actually it isn't. So that's quite a specialised thing that I think fiction offers that other things in life don't offer. It does mean, though, that you would have to take the decision that you're interested enough to challenge surface appearances of the world, and there's no reason why you should be, because if your life is motoring along quite nicely and the real world seems to work for you, then that's fine, and I'm not saying everyone has to do it, but my personal mission as an author is to constantly lift the stone and see, you know, the structure that's under there, that the stone is covering up. Now, as an author, my latest book, Stories We Tell Our Children, I've started to get sort of feedback from it, and it's a book ostensibly about the stories we give our children and the narratives we give our children, trying to equip them for adulthood. And that starts with fairy tales and middle grade YA, all this sort of stuff, but also non-literary forms such as advertising, which I believe is pernicious, online narratives which are dangerous potentially, boy band narratives, all this sort of stuff. And the feedback I've been getting is that people can relate to some of the stories. It seems to be, that a story that they themselves were told, or at least heard, experienced as a child. And which I find very pleasing, obviously, but is it because I've tapped into some vein of reality that every child experiences this? Well, no, of course not, because people are telling me they're responding to different stories from what other people are responding to. So that's the first thing. And second of all, I know as the author that of the 30 stories that go into that book, only 6 or 7 are directly from my own personal experience, either as a child or as a parent to my own children, and sort of, stories that pass between me and them. Which means there's sort of 23, 24 that largely came from my imagination, although a lot of them do contain nuggets from my personal experience, but not to the extent that the 6 or 7, which were almost, you can't put a figure on it, but say 75%, constructed from my own sort of life. And just to give you an example, so Brian of Bookish said that his favourite story, and one of my favourites in the collection, is called Legions of the Dam, and it's about jigsaws. And I can honestly say that of all the 30 stories, that contains 0% of anything personal that I experienced. That is a story entirely constructed from the imagination, which means it's 100% fictional. And yet, if that story is resonating with people, and I don't want to say this is how Brian took it, that he had a similar, or he could relate to it because he had a similar thing. I don't know if that's the level that Brian was reacting to, or just it was a story he liked, because it's unsettling, which it is. So I know that story is 100% fictional, that it has no bearing on reality, that it's purely a product of the imagination. And yet it's still wrought an effect, an emotional effect. And I've always said that the only truth in fiction is the emotional effect that it has on the reader. Because a reader cannot deny if they burst into tears or they laugh or, whatever or it makes them angry. Whatever their reaction is, that is true to them. And that has emerged from their act of reading the book. So that is a truth. That is a reality that can emerge from fiction, which I think is 100% more legitimate than facts or bits of information or whatever. Now, obviously, if you're feeling empathy for a character's situation, obviously that would fall under the emotional response of a reader that I've just talked about. So I'm not ruling out sort of empathic identification and subsequent feeling, through the character's travails. I'm not ruling that out. But I'd say that was more legitimate than a bit of information about them that I don't know, that they were the person that they once went to a political rally, that political rally really happened in that country, but the representation of it, the description of it in the novel may not be true. It may not be true because the author, their subjective view on the rally, depending which side of politics that they stood. It also might not be true because the way they use a political rally in their novel is an artifice. It helps the plot, or it helps give insight into the character, rather than being 100% only about the rally, that it's actually doing other things. So this is what I mean as an author. And novels are primarily works of the imagination. They may be based on real people or real facts, particularly historical fiction, but they are primarily works of the imagination. The characters never existed, and I want to restate that. Therefore, fiction is not real on that level. So that's my take on these questions. Endlessly fascinate me. What is literature for? What is fiction for? What can fiction do? How does fiction, translate into reality and vice versa, and all this sort of stuff. So there you have it. So just to say on the question of sort of realism in fiction or naturalism in fiction. The mere fact that fiction only deals with words, that's all an author has on their palette is words. So straight away they are representing reality in words in the same way as a painter is representing reality in paint, in the same way as a photographer is representing reality through the use of, well, I know it's all digital now, but it used to be sort of, silver nitrates, developing trays and all that sort of stuff. Because we have chosen these medium, straight away we are one step removed from the material world, because our material is words or blobs of paint or photographic paper and light, whatever your chosen medium may be. So automatically you're one step removed from portrayal of reality, and all you're doing is representing it in a different language from what reality itself is, which is a material. You know, if we accept this, and that's a whole other debate, if we accept that reality is objectively and materially singular, that a stone is a stone and a dog is a dog, and a dog is not a stone and a stone is not a dog, and, you know, all these sorts of stuff, then to write about a stone, to describe a stone in words, or to paint a dog on a canvas, they represent these hard and fast realities, but they are not the realities themselves. Okay, so I hope you found that of interest. Till next time, thanks very much.